G'day. I've just decided to put together a series of videos just to cover some basic plant identification terminology and concepts to try and help you if you're going to dive into the world of plant identification. And this first video I'm going to do is on what botanists refer to as simple versus compound leaves. So we're going to do a series of videos on leaves, their types, their arrangements, their shapes, and that sort of thing. But this first one is on leaf types, and you will see botanists refer to plants having simple leaves versus compound leaves. And the best place to start is with your flowering plants, your angiosperms, what we call the dicots and the monocots. Any flowering tree or shrub, like a dicot, is a really good place to start to get familiar with those two terms. And just from my experience in teaching botany in Australia and New South Wales in general, it's just something that students struggle with in the first part to get their heads around. What's a simple leaf and what's a compound leaf? And it can get a bit stressful for some people. So I've just got some examples here which I'm going to quickly show, and I've also teed it up with a PowerPoint with some slides that I'm going to show and tailor onto this video afterwards. But as an example, I've just got a plant here. It's called Raphaelepis. It's an exotic. It's not an Australian native, but this is as straightforward as it gets when you have simple leaves. If I just, grab all those there, we've just got very straightforward, simple leaf organs coming out from the main stem. We've got one there, we've got one on the other side of the stem here, and we've got another one there. Simple leaves. And if I let some more out, you can see that pattern continues up the stem. The important thing I'm going to show in the PowerPoint, and what I'll quickly cover here, is we're also looking for what's called an axillary bud in that leaf axil. And we're looking for the presence of that in simple and compound leaves. So I'm sure you're familiar with something like that, but where it gets tricky is if I throw in something like this. This is an Australian native called Indigofra, and this is a plant that has compound leaves. And what I mean by that is if I just pull off that there, and this plant's just finished flowering, you can see my leaves are these structures that come off the main stem here. And what is actually the case, if I can get a good sized one, is that whole structure is a leaf. And it's made up of leaflets. And the leaflets are about, a centimetre long in this case. And the leaf runs from the bottom there up to the top. And this is what we mean by compound leaves. Our axillary bud is still here in the leaf axil, and on the PowerPoint I'll show you some really good diagrams. And the whole leaf runs up there, and it's divided into these leaflets. And you can see there's another leaf here, and another leaf down below, and they're coming out at alternate sides of the stem, just like the Raphaelepis I showed in the first case. Another example of a compound leaf plant, if I can find it, it's a bit more grandiose, is this another Australian native called the scented rosewood, or Cyneum glandulosum. And I highlight this in the PowerPoint too. Again, similar thing. The main stem is back here in the centre. We've got our axillary buds also in the leaf axils. And believe it or not, that's a leaf. That's what we call a compound leaf, and it might rock your world a bit on what you understand a leaf to be, but when you've got a compound leaf plant, this is one example of what your leaves are going to look like. And there are some, variety in compound leaves, but this is your leaf. So if you look up in the description of this plant, you'll see the leaves are described as being, 20 centimetres long or something like that. But your leaflets were probably 7 centimetres long or something like that, and they might describe the number of leaflets as well. So simple versus compound leaves, it's a really fundamental botanical skill to get familiar with, and you'll see it referred to quite a lot. The thing I'll also cover is you can get a predominance of leaf types in plant genera and plant families. So it's also a good thing to latch onto for maybe trying to figure out what family a plant might belong to. It's not always clear cut. Some families have a mixture of species with different leaf types, but if you can learn which families have which predominantly or mostly, it's a really good skill to have. I'll see if I can get another example here, just for variety. I mean, here's a vine. I'll go from a woody shrub to a vine. Ivy, which is growing in my garden outside. Just another example, simple leaves. We've got a leaf there, got another leaf here, and we've got another leaf here. And hopefully you can see that that's one complete, leaf structure. No hint of a compound leaf there. They're just, again, coming out at, again, in this case, alternate sides of the stem, and they're simple leaves. But if I get something like this, going back to a flowering shrub or tree, this is a wattle, an Australian wattle. And again, we've got a compound leaf arrangement. So this one's a bit wilted and a few leaves missing, but you go up your main stem and you've got entire leaves which look like this. Compound leaves, and in this particular case it's called a bipinnate leaf, just because of the amount of division in the leaflets on the leaf. If you're familiar with Jacaranda trees, we've got plenty planted here in Australia. They're a South American plant. Best example of a bipinnate compound leaf. I'm sure you can visualize what a Jacaranda leaf looks like. But that's an example of another compound leaf. And basically the leaves are these tiny sort of comb-like teeth all over the leaf here. So I'm going to show you more examples of that on a PowerPoint, give you some diagrams so you can get out there and get familiar with simple and compound leaves. It really is one of the best places to start for your botany in the future. Okay, two very straightforward diagrams here to illustrate the difference between simple and compound leaves. I'm going to show these separately with all the labels on them a bit later, but this just gives you the overall picture of how they look. So very straightforward. On the left, a simple leaf plant, and you might relate this to something like a camellia or a privet or maybe a citrus tree, something like that. Just a plant like that with a flowering shrub with simple leaves. But if you have a look on the right, you can see that there's something different going on. Got this sort of single structure which has a cluster of leaves, and we start to think, yeah, that's very different to what's going on here on the left. And that's where we've got a compound leaf. We've got a single structure coming off the main stem with what we call leaflets. And it's a very important skill to pick up if you're going to dive into the world of identifying plants and knowing plants. It's something that confuses people, and I just encourage you to take your time and try and absorb the tips I give you here, and get hands-on with plants and have a good look. But that's just the two, or the contrast between the two setups that you're going to find with a lot of flowering plants. A simple leaf, and the labels you get for the simple leaf here. And there's one really important point which I'm going to start to labour here, and that's this structure called the axillary bud. So compound and simple leaves, it's all about detecting this structure, this axillary bud. The axillary bud is a bit of tissue that sits in the leaf axils between, where the leaf comes in and the main stem. And it's capable of growth. It can shoot. So the axillary bud can become an axillary shoot, where it's putting on like sort of maybe additional leaves or tiny leaves. It can also put out flowers. So if you think about plants that have axillary flowers, they might put out clusters of flowers or a few flowers in those leaf axils. But the axillary bud is sort of what it's all about. And some plants are not very useful in looking at axillary buds. I can think of some Australian natives where the axillary buds are very hard to see. But there's a lot of plants where you can see them quite easily. I've got some examples here. So the idea is to get your hands on some plants. You might need a hand lens, but normally the axillary buds are visible on a lot of plants. And just try and detect that you can see them and know where they are. And they're very crucial for determining your simple leaves versus your compound leaves. So just some terminology of a simple leaf. You know, you've got the mid vein in the center of the leaf, and sometimes that can get botanically described if it's conspicuous or showy or sunken or something like that. We've got the leaf stalk that holds the leaf onto the plant. That's called the petiole. And some plants, the leaves don't have petioles. You can have what's called sessile leaves, where there'll be no petiole and the base of the leaf just clasps to the stem, and you might know some plants that do that. But a lot of plants, the leaves will have a petiole, sometimes very long and sometimes short. The top of the leaf is called the apex. You got lateral veins coming off the mid vein, and I guess the main leaf surface, which does, I guess, most of the photosynthesis, that's called the leaf blade or the leaf lamina. And they can be all sorts of weird and wonderful shapes and sizes. And the edge of the leaf is called the leaf margin, and that can do a lot of weird and wonderful things too. It can be wavy or jagged. So the leaf margin can get described as well, especially if it's really obviously conspicuous or different or something like that. But just know that axillary bud, that's what we're going to be focusing on a bit just for the rest of the video here. Really straightforward example, just to illustrate the point. This is Camphor Laurel. It's an exotic in Australia. It's also a really serious environmental weed here with those leaves that smell like camphor oil. But a really good example of a simple leaved plant. And on the right, hopefully you can see what we're referring to as axillary buds. So if you trace the leaf down to the stem, you can see these obvious two structures. Now, they're not very long. They're probably, 2 to 3, 4 millimeters, something like that. But that's what we mean by axillary buds. And every plant that you look at, try and have a look and see what's going on. You can just see in this photo, if you can see where my mouse is pointing, it started to become an axillary shoot. It's starting to shoot there and put on a bit of growth. And like I said, the axillary buds can also put on flowers. But that's what we mean by axillary buds, just these tiny lumps of tissue in the leaf axils. Another simple example, this is Botosperum undulatum, an Australian native. And again, on the right, you can see the axillary buds where the leaves come in. So just those rounded grey or sort of paler structures is what we mean by axillary buds. So again, try and get your hands on some plants where have a good look first and see if the axillary bud is really obvious. So I can think of some plants like eucalypts, Australian eucalypts. The axillary buds aren't very obvious. Well, I don't think they're very obvious when I look at them, so they're not a good plant to demonstrate with. But most plants, a lot of plants, if you take your time and have a good look and maybe use a hand lens, you can latch onto the axillary buds. Just a handful of examples of the thousands of examples you could put in for simple leaves. But just a point to labour here is, we've got the iconic Banksias, Australian. The whole genus has simple leaves. There's, every Banksia you meet will have simple leaves. We've got Prostantheras, a member of the Lamiaceae family. It's a native mint bush. They've all got simple leaves. And then we've got this obscure bushland plant over here, Micromyrtus. It's a member of the Myrtaceae family. And just a point to labour here, what you can start to build in your mind, a bit of a framework, is getting familiar with plant groups that have one condition dominating over the other. So I guess the point I'm making here is botanists haven't arbitrarily stated that some plants have compound leaves and some plants have simple. It's simple. It's an evolved trait. It's an obvious evolved trait that species and related species have to adapt to their environment and survive. So what you tend to get, and not always, but what you tend to get is closely related plants having one condition rather than the other. So, to start building a framework, the Myrtaceae family, which is Micromyrtus is a member of, they all have simple leaves. There's no Myrtaceae species that has compound leaves. And it's a worldwide family. It's an iconic Australian family, ecologically dominant and important, but the family extends overseas as well, as does a lot of families. But they've all got simple leaves. You won't find a Myrtaceae plant that has compound leaves. So it's about, if you get familiar with your plant families and their features, and it helps you with identification, you can start to sort of memorize in your head the plant groups, the genera, the families that mostly have simple leaves, or maybe all have simple leaves, or hey, most species in that family has compound leaves. It is an evolved trait, and it does sometimes signify, closer. It does sort of bond closely related plants amongst other features as well. But it's just a tip to take on board there, and I'm going to show some examples of that at the end. Compound leaves. And again, the first important point to labour is the axillary bud. It's up here. But then, as you might have guessed, what you can do is you can come down here, down this central structure, I guess, and you might think, oh, well, I'll see if there's any axillary buds here in what I think are leaves, in inverted commas. And we don't find any. We don't find any axillary buds when we have a look here and here, or we have a look here and here. But we go back and we can find one axillary bud here. And now you only get one axillary bud per leaf. So when you find it, and there it is, and then you see this structure here coming out, you start to think, well, if I can't find any axillary buds here, and this structure sort of doesn't carry on any further, then it looks like I've got a compound leaf. So it's very important to determine that axillary bud, to determine where it is, see where it is, see what it looks like, check multiple leaves, make sure you get a representative sample, and see where that axillary bud sits. Some of the same terms here. We have a leaf petiole. The compound leaf will have a petiole, and it's supporting this whole structure. Where the leaflets start and the rest of the leaf extends, that section is called the rachis, or some people say the rachis. And that is the sort of interval there between the lowest leaflets and the top leaflet. Where you have leaflets, the leaflet petioles will be called petioles. So we sort of get in these diminutive or subwords when we've got these sort of substructures. So we've got leaflets and we've got petioles. They're just the petioles that hold the leaflets. And in this particular diagram, we've got a terminal leaflet indicated. Now, what's very cool is some plants, if they have compound leaves that look like this, and in other videos, we're going to show varieties of leaf shapes and compound leaf shapes. You can have an even number of leaflets, or you can have an odd number of leaflets. And check out some plants if you can. You might want to check out claret ash, or fraxinus, or something like that, or some maples. Some of the leaves have odd numbers of leaflets, and some of them have even numbers. And if they've got odd numbers, they tend to have a terminal leaflet. Some species, they'll throw up both. On the same plant, they'll throw up leaves which have an odd number, and plants which have an even number, leaves which have an even number. But typically it's consistent. It's consistent in a species. So if you've got leaves and they've got a terminal leaflet like this, it can be a useful identification feature for some species. So just have a look at that going on. But just remember, in some leaves, that terminal leaflet might not be there, and you might just have 8 leaflets or 10 leaflets in 4 pairs or 5 pairs or something like that. So just some examples. Here's a Australian native plant, scented rosewood. It's a common plant in Sydney bushland in the sort of wetter areas, but really good example of a compound leaf plant. And hopefully that diagram on the left, holding that up, it looks very different. If you go back in the video and look at the Camphor Laurel and the Botosperum, just what the leaves are doing just looks very different. I'm still holding the main stem, but what's going on off the main stem looks very different. And again, we have a look up and down the main stem, and we see these structures. And in this particular case, on this scented rosewood, the axillary buds are just starting to become axillary shoots. So they're starting to grow, putting on some leaves. They might even be the start of flower buds. But they're starting to grow, and they're about 1 centimetre long, but they're still there. We can still see there are these structures in the leaf axils, and they're our axillary buds. The photo on the right, I've got something slightly different, but what this could be is the start of an axillary bud, or it might be the remnant of an axillary shoot. So it might be an axillary shoot that is sort of snapped off at that particular point there and that particular point there. But we can still see there's something there. There's something obviously going on there in the leaf axils, and that's where our axillary bud should be or could be. Be sure to check multiple parts of the plant. Be sure to check everywhere. If we just cross to over here, the axillary buds don't look so obvious, but make sure you check multiple parts of the plant. Make sure you check the mature parts of the plant as well. Maybe avoid the new growth and have a look at the older growth and see what's going on. And again, I find my axillary buds down here on these mature leaves, but I don't find them up here. I don't find them when I look in amongst this sort of structure here. If I might think, well, maybe these are leaves, I'll just have a close look. I don't find any axillary buds. They're not there. But if I look down on the main stem, they're consistently there on these mature leaves. So make sure you just, take your time, have a close look, see what the axillary buds are doing. Just another example here, and I guess what I'm demonstrating here firstly is the overall canopy of this plant. And if you're like me and every now and then you like to lay down on the grass and look up through the canopy at the sky, just think about how this sort of differs to maybe looking up through an oak tree or a eucalyptus tree, or something with simple leaves like might be a camellia or a magnolia or something like that. And hopefully you can see that this just looks slightly different. There's sort of individual structures of leaves, clusters of leaves. They're sort of arranged really symmetrically or regularly. That one's coming down there, and then there's more coming out here, and the canopy just looks different. It's got a slightly different canopy to a lot of simple leaved plants, and it's another thing you can get your eye on, especially in the rainforest. You'll see a lot of plants sort of looking like this. You cut a bit off, you have a close look, and again, you can see that overall structure there. What are the leaves doing? Where's the main stem? What's going on? And if we zoom in, and this plant's got beautiful golden hairs over the stem and the leaves, we find the axillary buds. So if we look hard enough, we find them. They're there in the leaf axils where they should be. Go up and down the plant, have a good look. Always check multiple spots, get a representative sample. But there's our axillary buds. And again, if I hold one of those, structures out like that, I can't find any axillary buds at the bases of these, what might be leaves. I just can't see any. There's none there. And again, you start to think, well, what's going on here? I've got one axillary bud all the way back here, but there's none here. So I'm going to guess that I've got a compound leaf, and you'd be right if you think that. So that's the overall picture with determining your compound and your simple leaves. Just, you're looking for that axillary bud, you get one per leaf. You can get compound leaves looking like this. They can be quite long. So if you read a description about this plant, you might read that, it says leaves up to 50 centimeters long or maybe 70 centimeters long. and you read that and you go, the leaves are 70 centimeters long. I mean, these only look like they're 5 centimeters. Oh, maybe I've got a compound leaf. And then it might say the leaflets are 5 centimeters long, and they're, you know, in consistent opposite pairs or something like that. Then it might say leaves with up to 24 leaflets or 28 leaflets. You can see this leaf here. It's got about, you know, 24 leaflets on it, and it can probably get more than that. So make sure you sort of checking your references and homing in on terms like that and descriptions like that. I mean, once you read that your leaves are 50 centimeters long, you think, wow, that's a big leaf. Looks like I possibly have a compound leaf. So it's just another thing, you know, always back up your identifications with resources. But that's the idea with simple and compound leaves. So if you're in the rainforest at all, a fair bit, you'll find a lot of plants with compound leaves. It's not purely a rainforest thing, but a lot of plants in the rainforest, that's what they have. So just the last slide, just some tips, and look, I've said here, you know, generally, they're general tips, just take it with a pinch of salt. But species in a genus tend to have the same leaf type. It's not hard and fast, and you know, a lot of my colleagues out there will find a lot of examples where that's not the case, and that's true. But just generally, species in a genus will tend to have the same leaf type. All eucalypts have simple leaves. All Banksias have simple leaves. All camellias have simple leaves. And if you get on Wikipedia and read up about camellia or read up about Banksias, it'll say leaves simple, blah blah blah. So you can get familiar with some groups that have one or the other. I'll put in some exceptions there. There are some genera which have species, some with simple leaves and some with compound leaves. And an example here, some Australian genera, Brachychiton, Dodonia. There's a few others as well. They can have simple species with simple and other species with compound. I put there further down the Proteaceae family, which again is important in Australia, and it's important in the Southern Hemisphere generally. Most of them have simple leaves. If you learn Proteaceae species after Proteaceae species, they basically pretty much all have simple leaves, but you do get some grevilleas which get described as having compound leaves. We've got species like silky oak, which have what I think is really highly dissected simple leaves, and they sort of are looking like sort of oak tree leaves. But in the sort of professional websites we have here, they get described as having sort of compound leaf features. So it looks like grevilleas, some grevilleas are considered to have compound leaves, but the overwhelming majority of plants in the Proteaceae will have simple. Families such as Fabaceae, it's one of the world's biggest families. It's one we can get familiar with really quickly with their pea flowers, and we've got wattles in that group as well. They can have a combination. They can have genera with simple leaves, other genera with compound leaves. You can have species within a genera, some having simple leaves and some having compound leaves. So you get the whole sort of box and dice in there. But you can, you know, sort of get out there and find a lot of plant families which will have, you know, one or the other, or overwhelmingly one or the other. And it's just a framework I put in there. I don't want it to confuse you too much. Biology, it always throws in exceptions. I'd probably be remiss not to say something like wattles, which are in the family Fabaceae, Australian wattles and African wattles. They can have juvenile leaves which are compound, and then adult leaves which appear simple, the simple phyllodes. And look, that's a bit of a rare exception, and there might be some other plants that do that as well. But if you're looking at wattles, you can see that the juvenile foliage, when the seedling emerges, is compound, and then the adult leaves are simple. But that's a bit few and far between, and I don't want to confuse you too much with that. But hopefully this video has helped you getting to grips with that, simple versus compound leaves. The best way to do it is to get your hands on some plants. and have a go for yourself, and then maybe check a website and see if you're right. If you like the video, we'll be putting up some more in the future, some more botany, some more Australian bushlands, plant identification, and that sort of thing. So hit subscribe so you get some notifications, and I hope this has helped you. Thanks.